Did you know that the hamstrings are not trained during a squat? Well, I set a poll on my Instagram and found that of these 75,000 people that responded, 71% of y'all said that the squat does in fact train the hamstrings. So I guess this is a good topic to cover. So let me tell you the super interesting case on why the hamstrings are not trained during the squat and how this can actually help you bias the lateral and medial head of the triceps. Yes, I said the triceps. The short head of the biceps, as well as give you a newfound appreciation for the Bulgarian split squat. Let's get into it. First off, what are the hamstrings? Well, they're a muscle group composed of 4 different muscles that run along the back of your thigh. And they are one of the 3 main muscles in your lower posterior chain, others being glutes and calves. Now here's where things start to get interesting. The origin of 3 of the 4 heads of the hamstring, so minus the short head of the biceps femoris, is at the hip joint and then inserts at the back of the knee on the tibia and the fibula, so basically the lower leg part, meaning the hamstrings cross both the hip joint as well as the knee joint. Now muscles like the hamstring that crosses 2 joints in the body are known as bi-articular muscles. Other examples of bi-articular muscles include the rectus femoris in the quads, the long head of the triceps, as well as the long head of the biceps, and even the gastrocnemius, which is a big muscle in the calf. Now you might be thinking, okay, why are bi-articular muscles any different and how does this factor into the hamstrings not being active on a squat? Well, it all comes down to the hamstring's inability to properly stretch and contract. Let me explain. Muscles do work to move the body by either stretching, otherwise known as lengthening, this is known as the eccentric part of an exercise, or contracting, otherwise known as shortening, which is known as the concentric part of the exercise. Now for the hamstrings, the main function of the hamstrings is 1, to extend the hip, basically the thrusting motion or bring your leg back, and 2, flexing the knee, similar to on a seated hamstring curl. Now this means that at the hip, the hamstrings will stretch if you flex the hips, so send your hips back. This is the opposite of extension. And then at the knee joint, the hamstrings will stretch if you straighten the knee, which is the opposite of bending or flexing it. And of course, that means that you can contract the hamstrings if you bend it like in a hamstring curl. Now let's see what a squat involves. So on the eccentric, when you're going down, you're flexing at the hip joint as well as flexing at the knee joint. And then on the concentric part, you're extending at the hip as well as extending at the knee. And to make it simple, what determines which muscle is being trained is the muscle that is shortening on the concentric phase. So think of it as what muscles are shortening when I come up on a squat and do the hip extension as well as the knee extension. Now it's easy to think that, wait, if I'm extending at the hip, that means I'm training the hamstrings, right? Since the hamstrings are shortening on one end at the hip. Well, because the squat is a compound movement and you're also straightening the knee, the hamstrings on the other end are lengthening when you're straightening the knee. So I may have lost you there. So going back to the cheat sheet for hamstrings. If we extend the hip, we are contracting the hamstrings at the origin. But if we straighten the knee, like on a squat as well, we stretch the hamstrings at the insertion. And then vice versa for the eccentric part. So using this rubber band as an example, a muscle does work by stretching and contracting. Now imagine this is a hip and this is a knee joint and this rubber band is the hamstrings. If we are shortening at the hip, so here it's getting closer, but on this end, the knee joint is getting further, we're always gonna be at the same length, right? We're always gonna be doing this, concentric, eccentric. Meaning we can't get this stretch and contraction, which means the hamstrings can't really do any work. But not only that, we also have the glutes that also do hip extension, as well as the quads that do knee extension, that don't really suffer from this problem. Well, for the most part. We'll get to the rectus femoris later. Now to help you visualize this more, let me use a resistance band here, okay? So let's pretend we're the hamstrings. I know we're not getting the origin correctly, but let's say our thing's above the hip and then we're, right under the knee, okay? Notice when we squat, the length of the band more or less stays the same, right? It gets a little bit shorter, which probably mimics what happens in reality, but let's say we do a hamstring curl, it gets a lot shorter, right, with a hamstring curl. So this is essentially the point I'm trying to make. As we come down, we're stretching at the hip joint, we're contracting here, so the length kind of stays the same, and then on the concentric, we contract here at the hip, but then extend here, lengthen. We're basically going like this. The hamstrings are basically going pretty much like this, staying at the same length more or less, not being able to do this, which is how it's actually going to be doing the movement like on a hamstring curl or let's say like a stiff leg deadlift. Now there's one head of the hamstrings, the short head of the biceps femoris, that isn't biarticular, but instead it only crosses the knee joint, not even the hip joint. And like I mentioned, the knee joint, we're doing knee flexion on the way down on the eccentric part. We're not even doing knee flexion on the concentric, so it's not really even involved in that. And you might be thinking, well, my hamstrings feel super sore after a day of squatting. Well, that's actually not the hamstring. Likely it's the adductor magnus that you're feeling, which does in fact train hip extension. However, it's not part of the hamstring. Now, if you're thinking, okay, Tyler, I kind of just want to fast track this whole learning process because I know it is a lot and basically just take the guesswork out of getting to my fitness goals. Well, in that case, I highly recommend you apply to my exclusive one-on-one fitness coaching program where I pretty much do just that. I give you a custom workout program that is optimized with all this in mind, customized meal plan that is meant to basically have you enjoy what you're actually eating while still getting to your fitness goals, as well as weekly check-ins to make sure you're on track. And of course, you can't forget, probably the most important part is the communication piece. You can message me whenever you want. Any questions you might have, it can be about kind of explaining this again, whatever it is, you can do pretty much just that. So if you're interested, apply in the link in the description and act fast because summer is upon us, guys. Let's get to it, and girls, anyone. But anyways, back to the video. So you might be thinking, okay, biarticular muscles kind of make things complicated. And the good news is that there's not too many of them, but let me talk about a few other examples that basically are impacted by the same thing. First off, let's talk about the rectus femoris in the quads, which is the only head of the quads that, like the hamstrings, cross both the hip joint as well as the knee joint. Just, it's in front of your leg instead of behind your leg. Because of this, a normal squat doesn't train the rec fem for the similar reason as the hamstrings, but flipped. It will stretch on hip extension and flex on knee extension, which is why the leg extension is such an important exercise because it actually trains the rec fem since you're in this seated position, so you're isolating your hips in this more flexed position. So what you can do is focus on the knee extension where upon knee extension, you're contracting the rec fem as well as the other quads, and upon eccentric, you're stretching them. So rec fem's actually being worked here. However, we here like to optimize our training to try to get the best results. And it's been shown that quads are a muscle that tends to benefit from stretch-mediated hypertrophy, meaning that the stretch part of an exercise is more important than the contracted part of the exercise for growing the quads. However, the problem with the leg extension is it's flipped. It's a short and focused exercise where right here is the easiest part of the exercise and it progressively gets harder as you shorten. Enter the Bulgarian split squat, but we're not actually be focusing on this front leg because it is the back leg that is going to allow us to train the rec fem. So on a Bulgarian split squat, we actually want to be pressing off with both legs, not only the front leg, but also this back leg. And what happens with this back leg is we're essentially stabilizing the hip joint into extension. Notice how the hips doesn't really change, right? I'm not going like this. And because we're isolating this hip joint, the rec fem can sufficiently stretch as we're doing knee flexion and then contract upon knee extension exactly like in the leg extension. However, the only difference is the hardest part of this exercise for this back leg, as well as honestly the front leg, is this bottom stretch position instead of this top position like on the leg extension. Let's move on to the arms, specifically the biceps as well as the triceps. Now, the interesting thing is the long head of the biceps as well as the long head of the triceps both cross the shoulder joint as well as the elbow joint, so they are biarticular. Now, opposite of the last two examples, in the case of the biceps and triceps, the biarticular heads are sufficiently trained because we're doing isolation exercise, right? Bicep curl, you're only bending at the elbow joint. Tricep push down, you're only extending at the elbow joint. So instead, what we're gonna try to do is actually minimize the involvement of the bicep long head, tricep long head, in order to bias the other heads of the biceps and triceps. Let's get into it. So first off, with the triceps long head, at the shoulder, it stretches with shoulder flexion and contracts with shoulder extension. And then at the elbow, it stretches with elbow flexion and contracts with elbow extension. So what we do in order to unbias the triceps long head and by proxy, bias the other heads, the medial and the lateral head of the triceps, is by doing a close grip bench press or a tricep dip like this. So using the dip as an example, how this works is on the concentric, we are extending our elbow, which is good, it contracts the triceps. However, we're also bringing our shoulder into flexion. So the triceps is gonna be stretching at the shoulder since, again, we're stretching it by shoulder flexion, right? But we're also gonna be contracting it by extending our elbow. So same thing, rubber band example where, this is happening, right? It can't sufficiently do this, right? It can't sufficiently go like this, right? This is happening. Now, last example is going to be the biceps long head, which, like the triceps long head, crosses both the shoulder joint as well as the elbow joint, but we just flip things. At the shoulder, the long head stretches with shoulder extension and then contracts with shoulder flexion. And then at the elbow, it stretches with elbow extension and then contracts with elbow flexion. So what we do to unbias the biceps long head and by proxy bias the short head of the biceps is a chin up or a supinated pull down. Honestly, anything underhand will work. In fact, even a row would also apply to this. Basically, what we're doing on all these exercises is we're getting elbow flexion, which of course is a function of the biceps. However, we're also getting shoulder extension since we are bringing our upper arm down. This means we are contracting at the elbow end. However, we're stretching at the shoulder end. Remember, because biceps is going to stretch with shoulder extension, meaning bring our arm down. However, biceps are going to contract with elbow bending, so that happened. So I lost my freaking rubber band. But you guys get the idea, right? You can't sufficiently stretch or contract, right? It's just kind of doing this. It's stretching from one end and contracting from the other end. And you can actually feel this pretty much from anywhere. So let me show you something cool. So we have the knowledge that the long head of the biceps is basically our outer bicep, and then the short head is basically our inner bicep. So what I want you to do is flex your arm up here like this, right? You're gonna feel that both sides are pretty flexed, like you feel it, right? However, as you bring your arm down, you're gonna notice that the biceps long head actually feels a little bit softer than the short head. At least this is something I actually feel myself. It's kind of cool, but it's a quick little test if you guys want to feel that, or maybe you're bored or something like that. Now, I know I left out the gastrocnemius, which is also another biarticular muscle that crosses the knee joint as well as the ankle joint, but to make things short, basically the biarticular nature makes it so that when you're doing a seated calf raise, the gastrocnemius can't sufficiently basically, again, contribute to the exercise. All right, so hopefully now you have a better understanding on why the hamstrings aren't trained during a squat, but also have a way better understanding of how biarticular muscles work and honestly how muscles are trained in exercises as a whole. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Don't forget to leave a like as it helps support my page. Hit subscribe if you want to see more videos to level up your physique. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.